Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Bitcoin dominance continues to be an interesting topic. A long time ago, it felt like no one even cared about it, and now it is all people talk about. And then one of the reasons is because a lot of people are really hopeful that dominance is going to sort of fall off a cliff, kind of like we see here in 2021, and of course how we saw in 2017. And so that's the reason why, if you're new to the cryptoverse, it's been a hot topic of conversation. Bitcoin dominance has been in an uptrend really since 2022, and if you exclude that wick, it's been really moving up since late 2021 and the very beginning of 2022. If you exclude stablecoins, which we can actually do if we go on over to the website, if you exclude stablecoins to Bitcoin dominance, you'll actually see it bottomed in May of 2021. So, and the recent move actually took Bitcoin dominance, excluding stables, above 70%, even though when you include stables, it topped out at around 66%. Now, if you guys remember, we've talked a lot about navigating the path of Bitcoin dominance, right? And so a long time ago, the primary sort of conservative target that we put out was 60%. And one of the reasons for that target was because if you had looked at the fib retracement level from where Bitcoin dominance peaked from the cycle before, that corresponded to the 0.618 fib, which again, if you compare it to the cycle before that, you can see that it topped at the 0.618 fib. However, because all Bitcoin pairs were not at the range lows by the time that Bitcoin dominance was at 60%, we said there would likely be a pullback because we noted that every time Bitcoin dominance hits one of these fib levels, it seems to struggle to get through on the first approach. You can see it got rejected at the 0.382, it got rejected at the 0.5, it got rejected at the 0.618, and most recently it got rejected at the 0.786. And what's interesting is that every single time it gets rejected, people then immediately call for alt season, right? They immediately call for it. And every single time so far, they've sort of been on the wrong side of that. And then what happens is that liquidity then flows back to Bitcoin. So what happened was back when Bitcoin dominance was at 60%, which was the conservative target, what happened, right? This was back in October of 2024. So in October of 2024, we saw Bitcoin dominance hit 60, and we saw all Bitcoin pairs at 0.35. So while it made sense for dominance to get a drop back then, it did not make sense for it to be the top because of the fact that all Bitcoin pairs were still 27 to 28% above the range lows, right? So then we said, all right, now that we've hit 60%, and now that all Bitcoin pairs are at 0.35, we have to pivot and say, all right, look, dominance is likely going to get rejected in the short term, but unfortunately for the alt season callers, it's likely going to continue to go up. And sure enough, we saw it get rejected, and it actually went a little bit below the 0.5 fib, and it basically held support right at that 50-week moving average. Okay? That's where it ultimately held support at. Now, another reason back then that it kind of made sense was because Ethereum dominance, right? Like Ethereum dominance was still relatively high, at least compared to where it had bottomed out the cycle before, right? So in October of 2024, Ethereum dominance was still at like 13%. And as you guys know, my general thesis on a lot of these different cryptocurrencies is that they're oscillators at best. And so now that Ethereum dominance has come all the way down here to the range lows, and we saw ETH USD, you can say it, go home, it seems more likely than not that ETH has bottomed against Bitcoin. Just like some other altcoins have also bottomed a bit against Bitcoin during various parts of the cycle. But collectively, I don't know that they have. Now, what's really interesting is and we even said this, right? We even said this. It sounded crazy at the time, but look how intricate of a move this was. This slight pullback by ETH on its Bitcoin pair. Look at the low by ETH in April on its Bitcoin pair. And then how the low in June was a higher low. That's exactly what we said, right? We said the next higher low for ETH on its Bitcoin pair will be a lower low for altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs. And sure enough, the low that alts had in April was higher than the low that they got in June, right? So we said, look, Bitcoin dominance is likely going to find resistance at around 66%. In the same way it's found resistance at every single one of these fib levels, it's going to find resistance at that level. Even had a hard time breaking through the 0.236 once upon a time. And then it finally broke through 47%. And then the next milestone was 52. And then the next milestone was 56. And then the next one was 60. And then the next one was 66. All right? So we've covered the path pretty well, right? Rejection off of 60. Find support because alt Bitcoin pairs were not yet at the range lows. And go higher, the next obvious level, 66%. That's the 0.786. Now, it made sense to find rejection at 66%, at least on the first go, because you can see it's in line with what has historically happened. Now, the question is where do we go from here? Because there's a lot of people that are once again calling the top on Bitcoin dominance. And it's almost... it's not impossible, right? It's not impossible. But it's almost comical at some point. Like, if you've already called the top on dominance 10 times, like, why should anyone believe that this time is the time? Now, the one reason that there's a chance that they're right is because I think that ETH has bottomed against Bitcoin. So, if I'm right about that, which is a big if, I think it's bottomed for this cycle. If I'm right about that, and ETH has bottomed against Bitcoin, then whether Bitcoin dominance goes higher or not than its prior high will just simply depend on how low ETH goes on, theoretically, the next higher low by the ETH Bitcoin pair. Okay, so for instance, if ETH Bitcoin's next higher low is really high, then even if alt Bitcoin pairs put in a lower low, it doesn't necessarily mean that Bitcoin dominance goes to a higher high. You can see that Bitcoin dominance almost hit 66% in May. It actually got up to 65.3, and then ETH Bitcoin did fine, right? It continued to do well, but alt Bitcoin pairs went a lot lower by June, so Bitcoin dominance went a little bit higher, even though ETH Bitcoin put in a higher low. I think there's going to be another surge by Bitcoin dominance. And what's unclear at this point is whether it will lead to a higher high or a lower high. And a lot of it's going to just simply depend on the strength of Ethereum on its next pullback on its Bitcoin pair. If you look at ETH against Bitcoin, you can see that last cycle, once it bottomed, it had some rejections here, and some of these drops were a little bit more brutal than other drops, right? Even in 2017, right, there's similarities, right, where it goes up and then it sort of goes down a little bit, same kind of thing, and then it spikes up. Eventually, there comes the next pullback. And I think there is a good chance that whenever you get sort of that next pullback, it's going to send alts to lower valuations on their Bitcoin pairs. That might sound crazy, but just look how quickly alts went down when Bitcoin just lost, went down like a percent. It's like altcoins completely collapsed. What's really interesting right now is how a lot of people are worried, right? There's a lot of people that are worried. They're like, well, what if this is alt season? And they don't go to the range lows. The reason why I don't really think it matters, like, even if I'm wrong about the continued devaluation of altcoins on their Bitcoin pairs, even if I'm wrong, the reality is it doesn't matter, in my view, because even if I'm wrong, I'd still rather hold Ethereum because altcoins are bleeding to Ethereum. Look at this chart. It's total 3 minus USDT divided by ETH. Alts are bleeding to Ethereum, and every time I show you guys this chart, alts are down even more against Ethereum. Now they're down 42%. And every time I make the video and every time I tweet it out, people are like, well, just you wait for my altcoin to rally against ETH, and they just keep on bleeding to Ethereum. A lot of the people that make these assertions about Bitcoin dominance and altcoins and alt season, a lot of them, they've only just joined crypto in 2021. They've never seen how altcoins can be devalued against Ethereum for long periods of time. They never saw how long altcoins could be devalued against Bitcoin for long periods of time. So if I'm wrong about the altcoin market going to the range lows, I still would argue Ethereum is a better hold right now than the rest of the altcoin market. But what I think could very well happen is I think there's going to be another drop by alt Bitcoin pairs. You could still have alts fight it out for a little while. Like, I'm not suggesting they can't. In fact, in 2017, you'll notice that alts rallied from around the same level all the way up to about 0.55. And they made it there by late August. So there is a chance that we're just simply in kind of like this drawdown right here, where then alts rally again as we get into August against Bitcoin. And they very well may do that. But the problem is that I think they would still underperform Ethereum. That's the problem that I think the altcoin market has. The other thing to consider too is while this rally topped in late August, you should note that when alts bottomed in July, that local low, they only really rallied for about 3 to 4 weeks, right? 3 bars over 3 weeks. You can see that alts have already rallied 5 weeks. So it depends on what's more important. Is it the length of time that they've rallied against Bitcoin? Is it more of a seasonality thing? I don't fully know. What I will say, there does exist a scenario where alts could continue to rally against Bitcoin. But I still think that come late October, they're going to go down to a new low, is my base case. And I think they're going to go down to about that 0.25 level, the same spot they went in late 2017 and also where they went in 2019 and 2020, and they even went below that in 2021. It seems likely to me that that's ultimately the outcome that will happen. If you look at what happened last year, there was a low in June and then a lower low in late October. If you look at the year before, there was a low in June and then a lower low in late October. So we have this low in June. I think there's a good chance you're going to see alts go to a lower low in late October. Could they go higher first? Absolutely, right? Absolutely. I don't think necessarily that they can't. What I will say is the resistance that they're coming up to right now is basically that 50-week moving average, right? This is the same level that has provided resistance in the past, right? Where it struggles sometimes to get through. It can also provide support, but it has been resistance a number of times, that 50-week moving average. So I think that's more than likely going to happen. There is an example in 2022 where alts put in a low against Bitcoin in June, and then they didn't take out that low until the following March. That's not my base case right now, but the point is that what I would argue sort of the best case scenario would be in like a perfect world for altcoins is that 0.55 is going to be kind of like the ceiling, I think, on alt Bitcoin pairs, at least until they go to 0.25, right? It's not like they can't, that the path could be down and then up, could always be up and then down. But the problem that I have with them is that it seems like the eventual outcome is that they will in fact go to the range lows, even if ETH were to put in a higher low on its Bitcoin pair. Now, again, there's a lot of influencers out there that are shilling you altcoins left and right. But again, what if their altcoin they're shilling you is just bleeding against Ethereum? So go look at the altcoins being shilled and look to see what have they done since April against Ethereum. 99.99% of them have probably gone down. There's a few that have not. And if you have one of those, that's different, right? There's always a few exceptions to the rule. But the problem is that people are just kind of blindly saying, oh, Ben's wrong about alts because my alt's up 20% this week. Well, first of all, I wasn't talking about your alt. Second of all, who cares if your alt or if someone else's alt went up 20% if Ethereum went up 50? Because Ethereum is lower risk than that altcoin, and you're getting a higher return. So that's the reason, right? That's the reason why I mentioned that. So my thought process on Bitcoin dominance is that, this makes sense for it to find some support here at around 60%. There does exist a world where, like it bounces up and then even goes below this level very briefly. But I do think, regardless of the short-term outcome, there will be another surge, likely back up near the prior highs, if not a new high, sometime in the not-so-distant future, right? Probably sometime in the next few months, you will likely see that. It could be, it could be something like what you saw back over here in 2021, where it just kind of goes back up and sweeps the high. That's a possibility. It could be any number of things. But the point here is that, or one of the things to consider that might affect this is that the markets are really starting to price in rate cuts, starting in September. And it seems like that's the most likely outcome. I could see one thing happening, right? Like if the unemployment rate remains constant and inflation starts to go back up, that might actually delay rate cuts. And if that happens, you could start to see those altcoins give back some of those gains on their Bitcoin pairs. If you're used to thinking in terms of altcoins on their USD pairs, then a lot of my analysis is not going to be that exciting for you, because you only might care about how the altcoin is behaving on its USD valuation, when to me, that's completely irrelevant, right? If Bitcoin goes up 5 or 6x like it did over the last few years, and the altcoin in question only went up a small fraction of that, or it only went up against Bitcoin for one of those 4 years, you're still just better off holding Bitcoin, in my opinion. It's easy to be bullish on 100 different altcoins, and then 4 years later, go cherry pick the 2 or 3 that outperformed Bitcoin. But for the most part, most of these altcoins bled against Bitcoin, and now they're bleeding against Ethereum. Okay, so what I would watch for is, let's see if this 50-week SMA holds, because this is what held last year. And remember, this is a very similar setup. The only thing different is that the time in which it's taking place. How is it the same? Well, the way it's the same is that Bitcoin dominance got the same type of pullback, almost the exact same pullback. Let me get one that has a little bit more history here, right? But it almost got the exact same. Bitcoin dominance basically got that same exact pullback last year, when Bitcoin USD broke to a new cycle high. And you can see it's the same thing basically this year. So Bitcoin USD breaks to a new cycle high in November, and then Bitcoin dominance goes to the 50-week SMA. What happened here, right? Right here, Bitcoin USD broke to a new cycle high, and then what happened? Bitcoin dominance dropped, but then also it was kind of a fake breakout where it came back down. And so as it came back down, Bitcoin dominance went back up. But then when Bitcoin USD broke through again in a more sustained breakout than the first one, Bitcoin dominance then dropped to the 50-week moving average. So you could argue that what would cause Bitcoin dominance to start going up, back up again, would be consolidation by Bitcoin, right? If there's any type of consolidation, that could lead to it. If Bitcoin starts to not move as much for a week or two, that could cause altcoins to get a little spooked. And just remember, right, again, I don't have a crystal ball. I cannot possibly know if it's going to play out again. But if you look at monthly returns, there is an example where Bitcoin, can sometimes go up in August, September timeframes. If you look at 2017, Bitcoin did go up in August. So I don't want to pretend like it can't happen, but I would also say that if Bitcoin goes up anywhere what it did in 2017, Bitcoin dominance would likely go up, not down, if it went up that much. The last 3 years, Bitcoin has dropped about 12 to 14% in August. Again, I can't say for sure. What I know from history is that on average, Bitcoin's dropping in August or September. Doesn't have to be a big drop, could just be 10%, and then it runs. You could have a scenario where Bitcoin USD just gets one of those like brief pullbacks at some point in the next like 2 months, where maybe what it does is it just back tests this level, right? Like maybe it just drops back down to like 113K or something like that. And if that happens, you would likely see Bitcoin dominance start to surge back up. Or if Bitcoin were to break out, just kind of continue this move to the upside, I think after a little while, you would likely see Bitcoin dominance start to go back up with it again. If you look in 2023, you'll see that when Bitcoin USD broke out, there was also a pullback by dominance, but Bitcoin continued to go up, and then dominance started bouncing back up to the upside because people didn't want to miss the Bitcoin dominance rally, right? So my thought process here is that liquidity will likely flow back into Bitcoin. I would say starting late August at the latest. It could happen before then. The reason why I don't care about the exact timing is because, first of all, I don't have a crystal ball, which I will have to forgive myself for. Second of all, even if alts do rally against Bitcoin, they're still bleeding against Ethereum, and so I think Ethereum is the better hold. So for me, I think that is the better way to play it. And also what you can do is if you really like Ethereum, but you also kind of understand like why Bitcoin, let's say you were an ETH maxi in 2022 through 2024, and the market, you kind of showed you why Bitcoin dominance is important, but you also want to throw ETH in there as well, you could watch Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance. And I think that chart, to me, this is going to sound crazy, but like, I look at that chart and sometimes I wonder, because 2 cycles ago, it went all the way up to 85%. Last cycle, it went up to about 85. I mean, it went above 85. Now it's at 73. But sometimes I wonder, is that a possibility? It looks like there's a lot of distance to go between here and there. But I'm telling you guys right now, think about how many times people have thought that something was never going to get somewhere, right? Like, think about how many times people looked at this ETH Bitcoin market cap ratio and said it would never go back down here when it was up here. And guess what? It did. So when I look at what I call Bluechip dominance, Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance, I look at it, and to me, I think Ethereum dominance is going to go up, but I also could see Bitcoin dominance making a surge back up to 66%. And what happens if dominance of Bitcoin goes up by about 5%, but also the dominance of Ethereum goes up? Bitcoin dominance could go up because alts are dropping against Bitcoin, not because Ethereum necessarily is. There's a good chance that whenever alts do drop against Bitcoin again, it's because ETH is getting a pullback, but it could be something like where ETH dominance goes up 1% or 2% and then consolidates, and then Bitcoin dominance goes up 1% or 2% and then consolidates. And then before you know it, this metric is a lot higher, okay? Remember, last cycle, it got up there pretty quickly. I mean, at one point in August of 2020, it was at 69%. And then by December, it was at 85%. So don't say it can't happen, because I've seen crazier things. And with how quickly alts are bleeding to Ethereum right now, and my assessment that they'll likely drop down here, like from the current levels, I think that alts will likely drop another 20% against Ethereum. If that happens and all Bitcoin pairs eventually go to the range lows, maybe that puts Bitcoin dominance plus ETH dominance all the way back. This is plus USDT plus USDC, but maybe that would put this metric back up to 85%. You can also look at Bitcoin dominance plus Ethereum dominance plus USDC dominance plus USDT dominance and see that every time it hits that 82% level, it gets rejected. And there's a chance, right? There's a chance that it could go lower. Like maybe it tags this trend line. But the point is that the coveted alt season that people want so much didn't actually occur last cycle until it broke through 82%, right? And it went all the way up to 89%. So what if this time's not different, right? What if this is ultimately going to break to the upside? And you can even see that it had a similar pullback right here in November of 2020, found support around that 50-week moving average, and then just shot up. Just putting it on your radar, because I've seen a lot of people call for alt season again. And while they're more likely to be right the closer we get to the end of this year, there's a big part of me that just thinks, hey, why can't it just do what it did in 2017, where you get a rally for a few weeks, but then it still goes to the range lows by late October? If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.